for this book because I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of the store, but it's named after the owner's grandmother, who was killed at a concentration camp in Europe. She was Hungarian, and she had a great love for books and for learning, and she instilled that in her son, who survived and made his way to the US. And so this bookstore, R.J. Julia, is, yeah, it's part of that legacy. So it's really special for me to be here, especially given that context. So that connection brings me to David and Sippy, right? So David and Sippy are an interesting story because this was not the book I set out to write. I was looking for stories about refugees. I also have a connection to the Holocaust. My 4 grandparents are survivors, and they went to Brazil. So I was interested in learning how easy was it to come to the US in the 1940s, you know, during World War II. It was not easy. It was kind of like what's happening now. So I wanted to find out stories about people who came here in different ways. So someone told me, go meet David. David has a fascinating story. He's a cantor at my synagogue, and he, yeah, he's great. You'll talk to him and you'll love him. So I went to David's house. He lives in Levittown, Pennsylvania. He was very welcoming and warm, and he told me this story, which, you know, it was a tough story. He grew up in Warsaw. He loved the opera. His family loved opera. He was very musical. He grew up kind of, they wanted him to be an opera singer, which he wanted to also. So he grew up singing, and in a nice middle-class family. He went to opera houses in Warsaw and had a very, you know, normalish life, pretty assimilated life, until the war started drawing near and everything, you know, changed from one day to the next. Actually, from his bar mitzvah day to the next day. Literally, he had his bar mitzvah, and then the day after, the war started. So everything changed. He ended up in the Warsaw Ghetto, and I'm not going to get into the details, but he found his entire family one day in a pile of corpses. And he was 15 years old at that point. So he sees his family in a pile of corpses, and he's on his own. He has no one left. He runs away, and he goes through all these adventures. Wouldn't call it adventures, but he's escaping. He was very astute, and he was able to think clearly at times when I can't imagine what I would have done. So he's telling me all these stories, and all of a sudden he said, you know, I also survived Auschwitz. I was carrying bodies, and eventually I was singing to the Nazis, so I wasn't carrying bodies anymore. But I survived Auschwitz. And then I escaped a death march and joined the US Army. He became a soldier with the American Army after the war. He was actually in uniform. And that's how he came to the US. So that was the story I was looking for. And that in itself is a crazy, fascinating story. So I was ready to leave after he told me that. I stood up, and then he says, oh, and I had this girlfriend in Auschwitz. And so I sat back down. A girlfriend in Auschwitz, the death camp. I was just, I mean, it doesn't make sense. And then he said, yeah, she was my girlfriend, and she was a very special person. She was a graphic designer. And I said, wait, we're talking about Auschwitz, the death camp. Yes, she was a graphic designer. She was my girlfriend in Auschwitz. We used to meet secretly, and it was very dangerous. We were very careful, but you know, we were able to meet. We were able to have a relationship, and then we didn't see each other for 7 decades. And a couple of years ago, I saw her in Manhattan. And I was just, I mean, you hear something like that and it's, how do you handle that? I didn't know what to do with myself, especially as a journalist. You hear that and it's like, I need to clear my schedule for the next always so that I can figure out what just happened here. So Tippy, unfortunately, at this point had passed away. So I wasn't able to speak with her. However, there was a lot of information available about Tippy. But before I get into that, I want to read you a small piece of the book because I know you all can read, so I'm not waste your time. Okay. They first saw each other at the sauna, surrounded by piles of clothing. The air was thick and hot. They were in one of the few places that provided warmth during the unforgiving Polish winter. Here, workers submerged garments in steam kettles and watched smoke rise outside a window. Here, surrounded by worn, soiled rags, a boy and a girl met. He was 17, with a clean-shaven head and a round face. Despite it all, he was relatively well-fed. His striped uniform was neat and tailored, clean. Perhaps this was part of his allure. He stood out. In a world of stripes, you weren't supposed to stand out. You had to live by the rules, blend like shadows on the verge of disappearing. Sometimes at night, he was summoned out of his wooden bunk to sing. His tenor was beautiful, operatic. It had once earned him an audience in his hometown. Here, he remained a soloist, still a star of sorts. When she showed up, he could almost forget where he was. The sight of her gave him something to look forward to. At 4 feet and 11 inches, she was petite but sturdy, her legs muscular, her face wide and angled, framed by thick chestnut hair that was still growing in. From a distance, she seemed unassuming, eager to ignore. Up close, she was anything but. Her deep-set eyes, brown like his, were sharp and alert, but she had an easy smile. She moved with a self-assurance that was rare in their milieu. His eyes on her, he felt a flutter. A girl was looking at him. Her glance lingered. He was sure of it. And here, it was easy to forget that his old world still existed, a world of possibilities, promises, of desire. When he saw her, he remembered. She wasn't supposed to be there in the all-male part of the grounds, yet she'd made a habit of getting herself into places where she shouldn't be. She was 25 years old and she knew what she wanted. She'd been like this as a young girl and hadn't changed in all the years since. If anything, her tenacity had only grown. It wasn't that she believed in taking unnecessary risks. In a world of chaos, she craved structure and order, logic and reason. But this place had a way of making you do what you least expected. It had a way of making life-threatening risks seem reasonable. Perhaps because here, nothing was reasonable. She had her escape, her art, and yet she was alone. The boy across the room had a pleasant face. He seemed sweet, eager. Something about him made her want to come back, made her reckless. It was wintertime in Birkenau, the largest and deadliest camp in Auschwitz. So this was basically my introduction to Zippy, because David told me the story, and he told me the details. Someone asked me how I was able to write this. He told me a lot of details. I pressed him on questions like, what were you wearing? What was she wearing? What did she look like? She looked clean. Was she beautiful? She was a woman. She was looking at me. And then he told me several times, you know, I felt so special. She was looking at me. And I asked him, so like, what did she smell like? And he said, well, it smelled like a woman. He said, she smelled so good. like a woman. So those were kind of the details I was able to get from him. And he was able to tell me where they were, where they met. They met on the stack of clothes. So the Nazis would, when you came in, they would take people's clothing, they would package it up, put it into these like thick bricks of clothing, really tightly wound, put it in corners. And so they stacked these one on top of the other and made it so that you could remove them if you knew, and then go inside the opening. And then you had kind of this little cave that you could hide in.
Wow.
So this is what they did, and this is where they met. And this was close to the crematoriums, which, by the way, the Nazis also, it was the outside the crematoriums was the most beautiful part of the camp. They decorated with flowers, beautiful gardens. You wouldn't know unless you knew. And you knew because the chimneys were constantly, smoke was coming up and the smell was very obvious. But they were able to meet there, and that's how it became kind of a love story, very unexpected for both of them, I think, because they both arrived on the verge of death, right? He came there as a 15-year-old boy who'd been through hell and alone in the world. And his first job when he got there was carrying corpses of the dead. And he would get very little soup, very little food. He was wasting away, and they would get diseases all the time. They were living in, these bunk beds that 3 people shared, and they were like stacked in 3s. So he was almost dying until a Nazi learned that he could sing. And so he said, okay, come entertain us. And that's when he got an inside job where he didn't have to go outside carrying corpses anymore. He was inside, and he was able to fill up because he started getting extra rations. So suddenly he's not just worrying every day about food, which is what, when I read testimonies, everyone just wanted to have food. It was like the only thing people could think about. Romance was the last thing on anyone's mind. So once he started filling up and he was singing, he was able to, think about other things. He was able to notice a woman who, by the way, was not supposed to be there, right? So here's the thing about Tsippi. I could not meet her because she was already dead, unfortunately, by the time I learned her story. And she didn't have kids. Her husband had already passed away. And her brother, who lived in Australia, had already passed away. So she had great nieces who live in Europe, but no one really close to her who I could speak with, family-wise. However, after the Holocaust, she became this, what someone described to me as a historian's historian. She never gave interviews to the press. She never went out on speaking engagements. She didn't do any of that. She didn't film anything. She filmed oral testimonies. All she wanted to do was speak with historians and tell them her experience. And she wanted to correct people. She wanted to make sure people understood exactly what happened. So there were a handful of historians that got the opportunity to meet her and interview her. And they wrote a book about Tsippi, each one from a different perspective of her life. So it was really interesting because it's 5 different perspectives of 5 different historians have their very own way of doing things and very own expertise. And then it kind of created this figure of this woman that was very interesting. So I found these historians and I spoke with them, and they were all extremely protective of Tsippi. It was like they all were her family. So they were also very suspicious of me because I was asking around about Tsippi and she wasn't there to protect herself. And they knew that she was this hard personality. She told one historian, who was this Joan Ringelheim, she was a major historian who worked at the Auschwitz, who worked at the Holocaust Museum in DC, She passed away unfortunately last year, but he told her, Tippy told her, I won't speak to you unless you can show me that you know what I'm talking about. So she kind of made her pass a test, do you understand what Auschwitz was? Do you understand exactly, what the Nazis were doing? Do you understand that she made her jump through hurdles before she spoke with her? So finally, Joan spoke with her and she was intimidated, but it worked out. And every historian I spoke with was the same way. They felt intimidated by Tiffy. She was very hard-headed, and she always was right. She knew everything best, but they all became family. They were extremely loyal to her. So I started getting this picture of this woman who I was intimidated by. And I knew that I had to get everything right, obviously because I'm a journalist and I want to get everything right, but also because I was doing this and I wanted Sippy to be happy with this book. So I interviewed everyone I could find who knew her. I read every oral testimony that she'd given, and she actually gave quite a few oral testimonies, which were extremely illuminating. The first one she gave was right after the war. She was still in a DP camp, and and I listened to it, and it's interesting even to hear the voice change, through the years. And then the last testimony she gave was in 2008. So there were hours and hours for me to listen to, and that was fantastic. So I felt like I got to know her, but she never spoke during these testimonies about her relationship with David, not once. So I had this conundrum because David had all these details, right, about their relationship, but Tippy hadn't said anything publicly. And this was before I wrote the New York Times article that became this book, that expanded into this book. So I didn't want to write something without having confirmation about this. So I started asking around, and then a couple of historians told me, she did tell me about this relationship, and they actually had notes of conversations with Tippy about this relationship. And she was a little bit brokenhearted from this relationship. So it wasn't something that she wanted to speak about publicly very often, but she acknowledged it. So once I felt like there was acknowledgement, and there was an audio tape where I heard both of them together during their reunion. Once I had all that, I felt comfortable telling the story because I knew that it happened, and I heard her saying what they did together. They were reminiscing together about it. So once I had that, I felt comfortable. So Tippy, she was one of the first people to arrive in Auschwitz. She came with the second transport to Auschwitz when Birkenau was still being built. And she actually was one of the prisoners who was building Birkenau when she arrived. She was carrying these enormous stones, and, she was this 4'11" woman who by the time probably weighed 90 pounds or something like that. And she was carrying these stones and building these blocks for prisoners where she would be sleeping. And one day a roof fell on her back, and she wasn't able to do this anymore. Eventually, there's a lot that happens to get her to this other place. But she went through illness, she was near death, and eventually she got to a place where she was considered a privileged prisoner because the Nazis learned of her talent and her skills in graphic design. She was among the first graphic designers in her town. No woman or Jew had ever been a graphic designer where she lived. It was actually very difficult for a woman, Jewish woman, to get into that field. So she was very hard-headed. She made it in the field. She got the skill set. And in Auschwitz, it saved her because she used the skill set to help the Nazis get organized, meaning she at first was drawing stripes on prisoners' uniforms because they ran out of those striped pajamas that everyone's used to seeing. So they had to wear civilian clothes, but they still needed to be seen from far away so they could tell who's a prisoner. So she drew these big, thick lines on their backs. And then eventually she was creating these charts with statistics about who's coming in, who's going out, and she was keeping lists of prisoners. And so she was very useful to the Nazis. So she had this perspective, but at the same time, she had access, right? She had these lists of prisoners. She was able to substitute numbers, move things around. She had to be very careful about it because if she was caught, she was killed. But she got to a point where she was able to use a number of someone who's already dead and substitute that into someone who was living and who had been slotted to die. So by doing that, she saved thousands of lives. And there were other things that I started learning as I was researching Tsippi that were fascinating about how these women resisted. You know, we've read a lot about how the men's camp worked, but the women's camp was different. There was kind of this sisterhood in the women's camp. One woman would work in a place where they had underwear, and she would put on 5 layers of underwear so that she could give it to women who didn't have any. She could sneak it to them. One woman worked in the fields where there were onions, and she knew other people were hungry. She was able to carry a few with her and give it to the other people. So these women helped each other. And then there were other things that Tsippi eventually was able to do too, because she had this privileged position. She had her own little office in Birkenau, which is just, you know, kind of mind-blowing. She had a door she could close. So when someone was very sick, the Nazis thought, you know, you're not useful anymore. So if you were very sick, you were likely going to be killed or just left in the infirmary to die. Tsippi tried to get women who were sick into her office, saying, I need help with creating, you know, charts. I need help with this or that. And she would create reasons to bring women in, keep them in her office until they got better, got healthier, and then they were able to go do something else. She was also able to move people around. You know, someone was slotted to go outside. She was able to get them to go work inside instead. So the more I learned about these different acts of resistance, the more intrigued I was about Tsippi. And after the war, she had this whole other life, which David did too. She was working in a DP camp. She worked with this underground movement that helped people move from different zones in Germany and go to Palestine. She eventually found her brother, who was the only person in her family who survived. And they lived in her old town, Bratislava, for a while in Slovakia. And then eventually she landed in the US with her husband, who was this academic, a mathematician who taught at NYU. David had a different trajectory. He had always dreamed of coming to the United States. And that was, you know, that was part of what led me to him. He had this amazing story of coming to the place of his dreams, right? So he landed in the US as a soldier. And I'm not going to give away too much, but suffice to say, by the time I met him, he had a family. He was living in this nice, you know, white picket fence house with an American flag in the front. His grandson was at home with him when I met him. He was very proud of his family. His son was a rabbi, and he was very happy. So they each had their own lives. But in between, this magic happened, right? They met in a place where nothing was possible. They met in a place where people came to die, a place where people were numbered, right? You entered, and immediately as you were checked in, you went through registration, you were given a number. The number was tattooed on your forearm, and that's who you were from now on. You were number whatever. But when they met, they weren't numbers, you know, that's part of the specialness, I think, that David was trying to convey to me. He told me, you know, she made me feel special because when they were together, they were actual human beings again, right? They were able to talk to each other about music. He told me they didn't do much talking. He had this little smile on his side. But they did talk about music. He sang to her he had this beautiful operatic voice. And she played the mandolin, not to him, but you know, she spoke about the time she played the mandolin. She grew up listening to music, also a big music lover, and she played in an orchestra. And actually there was, believe it or not, an orchestra in Birkenau. There were several orchestras in Birkenau. There were the men's orchestra, there were a few different ones. And then there was the women's orchestra, which Tsippi helped create, which was also, by the way, a way to save people, because if you were in the orchestra, you were seen as a kind of privileged prisoner. You lived in a special place. You were constantly rehearsing. It wasn't an easy lifestyle by any means. Sorry, I have 5 minutes left, and then I'm going to do some Q&As. But that was, you know, the orchestra was life-saving, because you got heat, you got a little extra food. You weren't carrying hard, you know, huge rocks. You weren't out in the freezing cold with very little clothing on. You weren't out in the heat without any protection. So yeah, so when they connected, they became people again. And I think that's, to me, the beauty of their story. It's called Lovers in Auschwitz, which to me, it's a misnomer. I mean, it feels weird to say, right? It's a strange combination. It's like the step back that I took when David told me he had a girlfriend in Auschwitz, you know, like, what does that mean? But it was when they became human again in Auschwitz, and they were able to remind each other that there's still beauty, there's light, there's a way to connect with people, by just being human again. So that's the message that I think I want people to take away from my book, that in times of darkness, there is this ability to connect that we have as human beings that can bring us back to light. So
Thank you so much. Does anyone have questions?
Do you have the details of how they found out about each other again? And
yeah, they had a friend in common in Birkenau, someone who David had known as a young boy. And he found a way to connect her to Tsippi so that Tsippi would kind of take care of her when she arrived in Birkenau. And Tsippi protected her throughout the time they were there. And they remained in touch. And so eventually he started asking questions, and he had this question in his mind. He thought, you know, maybe she saved his life. He wasn't sure. How did he survive so long when most people who were in Auschwitz lived for, you know, a few months? He was there for a couple of years. So he always had this question. He knew that she was a special prisoner. Did she have something to do with how he survived? And so he wanted to connect with her, and that's, he did for his friend, and he also called the Holocaust Museum, he really chased after her.
Do you consider this a work of historical fiction or nonfiction?
It's nonfiction.
Because did
Everything-
you have to make some leaps of scene setting and with dialogue and that kind of thing, or?
No, so if you look at it, there's
Mhm.
no, the dialogue that's in italics, the dialogue's all in italics, unless it's in, quotation marks, then you know that it's something that I heard directly that I'm
Okay.
able to quote. If it's in italics, it's something that either David told me or that I heard in testimony. Everything is something that I was able to check. There's no fiction in it. That was actually something that I wanted to be certain about because of Tippy, I actually looked at, and this is a different story, but I was looking at different memoirs of people who knew Tippy in Auschwitz. And that was, I was able to cross-check, not just what she had told historians, but from other women who knew that she saved lives, who had seen her in action, saving people. So I was able to confirm that because I did feel like,
Mhm.
anyone can say I saved people's lives, but I wanted to confirm that. Yeah, and eventually I found a manuscript that she wrote that was unpublished. And that was very helpful too. So I was able to get a lot of information and that might read like fiction, but it's real.
So toward the end of the war, David and Sippy make an agreement. They're going to meet in Warsaw, and she goes to Warsaw with a friend for a couple of days. He never comes. And it seems as though she felt scorned. That was clear, but it seems like she carried that with her. Is that accurate?
I got that sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got that sense from speaking with a historian who knew her.
Mhm.
And this was around the time that David wanted to reconnect with her, and he called the Holocaust Museum. So yeah, he felt like when he spoke with her, he didn't keep his promise. They had made a promise. So I can understand her carrying that, but at the same time, he was a 17-year-old boy who had just lost his childhood, so I
Yeah.
can't blame him either.
Right. Oh,
There's no one to
absolutely.
blame
Yeah.
for this. Yeah.
And then that they were both at the same DP camp, but their paths never crossed. That's astonishing.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were in the DP camp and they never saw each other. And not only that, but when David was in, and this is, when he was in the death march, he was in the same death march with Sippy's future husband. He was in Dachau with him, and
Unreal.
yeah, there are all these intersections. Yeah. Thank you for reading.
So they went for 50 years before they saw each other again, is that?
72.
Wow.
And then what was their relationship like after that point when they?
They were both in their 90s. She was in bed, she couldn't move. She was already in a point where she could barely see. And when he first walked up to her, she didn't really recognize him. Until he leaned down and he said, "It's David." And his grandson was telling me that he was actually really nervous to that point because he didn't know what would happen if she wouldn't, what her frame of mind was like, but her eyes lit up. And it's like, she suddenly was like, "David," she recognized him, and she remembered so much of what they went through. And yeah, I mean, it was the last time they saw each other.
Does anyone mind if I ask a question? I was curious, you said that you were very inquisitive when you met with David and you asked a lot of probing questions. Was there anything that he shut down and he just said, "I'm not gonna go there, I can't relive that right now or ever with you for this"?
when he mentioned his family, how he found his family, he didn't want to talk about it. His eyes got moist and I didn't want to go there. By the way, David has a memoir that he published. He does mention Tippi. She's about 2 pages in the memoir because he did have a very full life. So he'd written about this and he had someone who wrote it with him. And sometime in my process, as I was writing this book, I get a call from someone who says, I have tapes of David. And at this point, it was already COVID. No, this was after COVID. And he had already passed away, unfortunately. So I wasn't able to do follow-up questions with him. But this woman contacted me and she said, I helped him write his memoir and I have hours and hours of tapes of interviews with him. So these were tapes that were recorded, I think in the 90s. I don't remember exactly, but he had gone through these points with her. And that's how she got it to the memoir. And I felt like I had enough so that I didn't need to make him go through that again.
Yeah.
What was the age difference? You said he was 17, she was older, 18.
She was 25.
When they met?
So today that would not be very kosher.
In your research, did you ever come across a book called The Volunteer?
Yes.
Did any of the stories in The Volunteer cross with your research?
Yeah, actually, I talk about it a little bit because that's an incredible story. The Volunteer is this man who volunteered to go to Auschwitz. He was not Jewish, but he went on a roundup because he wanted to go in. He was working for the resistance and he wanted to help build the resistance inside Auschwitz. And he was not killed in Auschwitz. He survived, only to be killed by the communists later. Anyway, yeah, so Tippi had she had some part in the resistance. She always refused to say that she was in resistance. And I think that was very common with people who were in the resistance because they've been trained to say, no, of course, I don't know anything. I don't know people's names. And then usually they didn't know people's names. They didn't know who was in the resistance. It's a self-preservation, right? But I don't think they crossed paths, directly, but he was building this movement and she was somehow part of it too.
Thank you.
We probably have time for one last question. This is a safe space. Anyone ask what you want to ask?
Did you have any surprise, any shock as this process was going?
You mean in my research?
Yes, in your research. Did something?
Yeah, I mean, there were a couple of surprises. There was the one time that I got a call from the woman who had all these tapes. That was amazing. And then there was this unpublished manuscript that I mentioned, that I saw as a footnote in one of the memoirs that I was researching, and that there was an unpublished manuscript by Tippi. So I saw this footnote years ago, and I was asking the historians, like, what's this manuscript? And nobody knew anything about it. So I asked everyone I spoke with, and everyone's like, I have no idea. Until eventually this woman called me back, a historian at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She said, I found this manuscript in a cardboard box in my guest room.
Wow.
I had written the final draft of the book. But it was the unpublished manuscript that Tippi had. And so I was running in Prospect Park and I kind of was like, stop everything. And how soon can I what can we do to get this like in my hands immediately? she actually photographed with her phone every single page of the manuscript. It was like over 80 pages, and she sent it to me that afternoon, and it was incredible because it confirmed so many of the stories I'd heard. And there were so many new details also that she'd written. There were little bits of emotion even in some of it. So I sent it to the historians who knew her because I wanted to confirm, you know, that this is hers. And they said it sounded like her. They said it's her. And these are all stories that we've heard. So they confirmed for me. Jürgen Matthaus, who edited the book about her, said, since it wasn't published, he wasn't sure how much of what was edited, you know, why it wasn't published, what, you know, why she wouldn't have wanted it out there. So for that reason, I don't quote directly from the manuscript because I don't know how much of it is in her voice, but it did serve as a resource. And that was a huge surprise. I was not expecting after my final draft.
Can I slip in one more?
Absolutely, why not?
How did their story, what lasting effects did it have on you? How do you think it has changed you?
Oh, that's a big question. Thank you. I think that, I mean, I knew my grandparents as survivors. None of them were in concentration camps, so I didn't know what people went through in concentration camps. This aspect of people becoming numbers and then coming back to Greenland when they connected, I think it just showed me the importance of human connection and how ultimately, you know, that's what makes us human, this desire to connect. And I think it shows me that we can survive anything if we are, or even, I don't mean that they survived because of the connection, but you can make things better. You can make things manageable, livable, if you're able to connect with people.
Could you speak briefly about how your grandparents survived outside of the camps?
Yeah, so they each have their own completely different story. I'll tell you briefly. One grandfather from the Ukraine, his mother and sister were killed in front of him, and he was sent to a ghetto with his father. Long story short, they joined the partisans. They escaped the ghetto and joined the partisans. He joined the Soviet army eventually, and he was able to fight Nazis and eventually survived and found his father after the war. One grandmother from Belarusia hid in a cellar of a couple of Polish women with her cousin and some family members. So she was in the cellar for 630 days. She described it as, you know, she was crouching down the whole time. So when she was finally liberated, she climbed up these steps and she had to learn to walk again. She had to learn to speak in her full voice again because she was only speaking in whispers for 630 days. My other grandmother went on a trip. She was sent to Tehran. She was a child of Tehran. I don't know if you're familiar with that. These are kids who were orphaned in Poland, and they were sent to Tehran on the way to Palestine to start a life there. You know, these are all young kids who didn't have any family. And then my other grandfather from Latvia, he was in the Soviet army. He was older, so he fought Nazis.
Well, we thank you so much, Karen.